Hello, hello. It's Chris here. Today for discussion, we have Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. Juan Rulfo was a Mexican writer. He doesn't have a particularly large bibliography. However, this work, Pedro Paramo, it's a slim work, small work, has become incredibly influential and is a very influential piece, especially in the genre of magical realism. It went on to influence writers such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who went on himself to write 100 Years of Solitude. And he identifies reading Pedro Paramo as being one of the most pivotal books that he's read. Now, I read this book twice in the span of 2 weeks. First, with the translation by Margaret Sayers Peden. Then, I purchased a physical copy because when I like a book so much, I feel I need to have it in the physical version. I need to have it. I need to be able to carry it around. Plus, it's a slim work, as you can see. And this is a translation by J. Weatherford. This is a much more modern translation, we can say. The translation by Margaret Sayers Peden is a bit more difficult to read, and I'll go into that. However, it can be much more fulfilling as well. Now, before I compare these translations, what is Pedro Paramo about? So this book was written in 1955, at least it was published, I believe, in 1955. And it concerns, we're starting off with the character of Juan Preciado. We don't really know his name until later on in the narrative, but he is going to the village of Comala to meet with his father. That's at least his quest, what's happening for him, his objective. And he's doing this because on his mother's dying breath, she requested this of him, that he should go to the town of Comala to see his father, Pedro Paramo, and take what was owed to him. What was owed to him, though? That's something that's quite interesting, and it's something that I'm not completely sure is resolved at the end of the story. And as Juan embarks on this story, we quickly come to realize it becomes apparent that Comala is a ghost town. No one lives in Comala anymore. At least there's no one alive there. And this is a town inhabited by spirits, by memories. This is a story of people stumbling through lives, seeking for redemption, where the shrouds of memory seem to haunt people, where ghosts become memories, and where life essentially just seems to be an endless waiting game in purgatory. The world becomes purgatory in Pedro Paramo. Now, the narrative can be very difficult to follow, especially if you read the translation by Margaret Sayers Peden. This translation has no chapter breaks. It has no breaks that you can tangibly discern other than having to identify them through little narrative clues. So it's just a long body of text. This creates a very dreamlike perception of the book, perception of the world, where time is kind of chucked out the window. It seems to go from present to past. We don't know what is happening. In between something is happening. There are ghosts who don't really quite know that they're ghosts yet. And it really has the reader question when this narrative is taking place. So I'll read a passage. It's a passage right from the start of both translations. It was during the dog days, the season, when the August wind blows hot, venomous with the rotten stench of saponaria blossoms. The road rose and fell. It rises or falls depending on whether you're coming or going. If you're leaving, it's uphill. But as you arrive, it's downhill. What did you say that town down there is called? Comala, senor. You're sure that's Comala? I'm sure, senor. It's a sorry-looking place. What happened to it? It's the times, senor. I had expected to see the town of my mother's memories, of her nostalgia laced with sighs. But she lived her lifetime sighing about Comala, about going back. But she never had. Now I had come in her place. I was seeing things through her eyes as she had seen them. She had given me her eyes to see, just as you pass the gate of Los Colimotes. There's a beautiful view of a green plain tinged with the yellow of ripe corn. From there you can see Comala turning the earth white and lighting it at night. Sorry, my reading is not too great now. Her voice was secret, muffled as if she was talking to herself. Mother. Now that was the translation by Margaret Sayers Peden. This is the translation by J. Weatherford. It was during the dog days of summer when the August winds blow hot, tainted by the rotting smell of saponaria flowers. The road rose and fell. It rises or falls according to whether one's coming or going. For the person who's leaving, it rises. For the one who's coming, it falls. What did you say the name of the town that town down there? Comala, senor. You sure we've already made it to Comala? I'm sure, senor. And why does it look sad? It's the times, senor. I had imagined I'd see the place of my mother's memories, of her nostalgia, a nostalgia of tattered sighs. She was always sighing, mourning the loss of Comala, hoping to return. But she never came back. Now I've come in her place, and I come bearing the same eyes with which she saw these things, because she gave me her eyes to see. There, just beyond Los Colimotes Pass, you'll find a beautiful view of a green plain, with a bit of yellow from the ripening corn. From that spot you'll see Comala, turning the land white, lighting it up at night. And her voice was secretive, almost without sound, as if she were speaking to herself. My mother. So the translation by Margaret Sayers Peden, the first one that I read, it's a translation that's much more ornate. There's a bit more flourish to it. It's not as staccato, I felt, as the translation by J. Weatherford. However, Sadin Peters has taken criticism for this, for kind of adding too much of a flourish to it. But because there are no chapter breaks, as you could see in here, J. Weatherford's, where there's a where the bold sort of indicates a new fragment, not as much a chapter, but a fragment. These are very short fragments that make up the novel, the novella. Sadin Peterson's version doesn't have these fragments. And because of that, readers have to rely on identifying certain tricks and certain events that signify a change in the narrative, certain techniques. And a technique that I identify is the weather. The changing weather is used as an indication of the fragments changing. Whenever weather or rain is mentioned, it often accompanies or introduces or ends a fragment. And this creates the effect, this emphasizes the effect of rain and weather being essentially timeless, being outside of time. When something is timeless, they no longer abide by the rules of time. When rain falls, we don't know whether it was falling now, whether it was falling 30 years ago. So we're not exactly sure. And that creates that sort of fracturing of time. Rain and weather, in particular, are used to that effect. So this narrative itself, it very much deals with death, Mexican traditions of death, and seeking redemption, whether we can seek redemption and how we seek it. Do we seek it through the Catholic Church? There's a character, a priestly character, who is very much the arbiter on who gets to be redeemed or not, it seems, in his world. He gets to decide who gets to be redeemed, but he himself is quite conflicted with this. He has quite a lot of power, he feels, in this world, and he does in the village, and he can just decide and say this person, took their own life, they should not be redeemed. However, at the same time, he can be bribed. He's seen to be quite bribable, and he himself, this priestly character, is very much in conflict with Pedro Paramo throughout the narrative. They are, I would say, the two most conflicting characters. If Pedro Paramo himself has an antagonist, it's the priest. But the priest is, at the same time, the only person who stands up to Pedro Paramo, because Pedro Paramo develops into a sort of mafiosa type of figure, a figure that is in many ways apathetic to almost everyone else in the world, except for who ends up being the woman of his desires, the woman that he loves quite a lot, Susanna. But he's quite apathetic to everyone else. He doesn't really care about the village. In fact, he lets the village essentially starve and wither away because of Susanna's love, because he cannot attain that. So there's a melding of the Mexican, what's thought of, I guess, as Mexican traditions as regards to death, that these spirits can talk, that they inhabit places, that places aren't just physical in a sense, but they're also psychic. They have powers that are very much have been affected by time itself. If something happened in a place, in a room, that energy resides there. And trauma is something that is carried forth in these places and by also these ghosts and these memories. Pedro Paramo itself is a story of memory. It's a story of how, whether our ghosts are really, ghosts could be, in a sense, memories of ourselves, our memories. And it does pose the question of whether in this world of purgatory, which Kamala represents, whether we all are, in a sense, ghosts, just fleeting memories of each other. So, because of this, we can look at the story in a very, very symbolic lens. We don't have to look at it in a literal lens of the narrative of Pedro Paramo himself, because he starts to develop into the central figure of the story. He's the eponymous figure that the story concerns itself with. However, he doesn't himself seem to have a ghost. Almost every other figure has a ghost that interacts with Juan Preciado, but there's no ghost of Pedro Paramo, and it creates a sort of silence for his character. yet at the same time his character occupies a central stage, and the narrative seems to revolve around him. The name of Pedro Paramo is also itself quite interesting. Pedro being Peter in Spanish. Paramo being, it seems to mean barren or desolate in Spanish from what I understand. So Peter the rock in which essentially the church was built on. So St. Peter. Pedro Paramo is this rock for Kamala. He develops into this rock. This the person with the most money in Kamala who has allowed it to flourish. Whether he himself has allowed it to flourish is something of debate, because he also appropriates and takes land from other people. Like I said, very much like a mafioso type. But everything around the village seems to revolve around him. But he's apathetic, as I mentioned. He doesn't seem to care, even with his sons. The sons that he does care about and that he does recognize, they do horrendous things. The one son that he recognizes, Miguel, does horrendous things. And Pedro Paramo he kind of brushes that off and says, oh, he's just a boy. Meanwhile, he's killing people and raping people. But going back to the symbolic lens, it can be seen as a story of uncovering pasts, of how we essentially use our memories to uncover who we are in the present. We go through the past to uncover we are in the present, and perhaps that will give us an insight into where we are going in our lives. And there is foreshadowing in Pedro Paramo. There is quite a lot of foreshadowing as it relates to Juan Preciado. And this foreshadowing is done on not just through the narrative structure itself being all over the place, so you know that something has happened already before it has been described as being happening, just because the effects of it have happened, which isn't exactly foreshadowing, but it's also embedded within the narrative itself. There is a sense of foreshadowing. And time itself does seem to take on the quality of being illusory in Pedro Paramo. And it poses the question of whether we are already dead or ghosts because of this. So there's a social, spiritual, and a narrative lens that we can look at Pedro Paramo. In the social lens, there are social conflicts that are explained. It's a historical lens. This is taking place, I believe, in the early 20th century in Mexico. And by this time, revolutionaries and large landowners were becoming, like Pedro Paramo himself, were becoming quite prominent and were in conflict with the more socialist, worker-focused movements. So there is the social lens there. There is perhaps a subtle commentary on capitalism and whether people really should be able to own this much land. However, the narrative doesn't go too deep into that. It leaves that sort of as just a small point to touch on. As I mentioned, the spiritual angle is also quite important. With the Mexican and Catholic beliefs on the dead, the traditional beliefs, they kind of intermix with each other. And the narrative is itself probably the most interesting lens to look at Pedro Paramo through, because it is in some ways a very disorienting and difficult read. These narrative techniques, it's not just that they sort of obliterate time in many ways, but they they demonstrate who they allow certain people to have voices that normally wouldn't have voices. And I think it is in this ability to allow certain characters to have voices, certain characters like prostitutes, certain characters like people who can barely hear and who are slightly crazy characters, to have these voices. They can demonstrate, it allows them to demonstrate aspects of their lives and their history in a way that allows for the narrative to slowly build up through all these little stories. So it's not a linear progression of the story where you know this, and this. It's that you start to know a little bit of what happens. You start to know a little bit about D. You start to know a little bit about C. You start to know a little bit about Z. You start to know a little bit about X. And then it all starts to blend into each other. The writing very much, it's quite beautiful, and but it's quite succinct as well. While, as I mentioned, St. Peter's translation is a bit more ornate, the story very much reads like a play in some ways. There's a lot of dialogue between characters. Some of the descriptions are through these characters and their dialogues. And the action itself is quite brief. So it does read very much like a drama, like a play, a little bit like a soap opera even. But a disorienting kind of ambling, uneven soap opera, but a brilliant story in itself. Now, Pedro Paramo, as I mentioned, him being the rock, the barren rock, we could say, he does represent the land, the materialness of the world. It might be too far to consider him as the devil. That might be too far. But he really is a character that seems to allow other people to do what they want, so far as it doesn't affect him in the world. He doesn't go about trying to chastise other people, tell them they shouldn't be doing that, they shouldn't be doing this. He's completely occupied with just attaining more wealth and having other people do what they want. So in some sense, you can see the parallels with the devil, or a sort of, maybe not the devil, but even a godlike figure, because he grants everyone that free will. However, that free will is sort of attained through him. It is through him. These characters don't seem to have free will on their own. Their free will is tethered to Pedro Paramo. Their wills are tethered to Pedro Paramo. In a dime, he can just fund revolutionaries to perhaps have them fight in another place other than encroach on his lands. He can call the priest and have the priest perform last rites on people that are needed, or have the priest bless his dead son, who was a horrible person. He can do all of these things. And the question is whether these people have free will, or whether they're just so enthralled by the material power that Pedro Paramo has himself. I found this to be an absolutely amazing read. It's such a great book in how the narration comes through. Many people find it difficult to read. I did find it difficult to read. However, it's not difficult in the writing itself. It's just in the narration. And it's not a very long book. You can get through this, within a few days. It's quite easy. But you will gain such a unique way at looking at stories and looking at narration itself from reading Pedro Paramo. I found it to be far more fulfilling than Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I thought 100 Years of Solitude was a great book for the first 100 pages, but then it started to fall apart. Pedro Paramo is very tight. It doesn't fall apart. Everything sort of ties in beautifully together. It's an excellent, excellent story. I highly recommend reading it. And thanks for watching. Take care.